Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam.
And my name is Kelly. Today, we have an update on Katie Gallagher's case, and we're going to be taking a look at two more cases in the New York City druggings, robberies, and subsequent murders. Only they follow a different pattern. Our victims today are Julio Ramirez and John Umberger, and these two have been identified as victims in a second string. Authorities have surmised there are two robbery crews prowling New York City right now. Sam and I have talked a lot about this one off air, and today we'll share the case details and our thoughts on them. Before I go too far into it, though, Sam, what's our question today?
My question today is because we are about to enter October and it's officially spooky season. What is the first horror movie you ever watched?
Girl, the first horror movie I ever watched, I had no business being there. I was too young. I don't remember. It was like elementary school. And it was Stephen King's It with Tim Curry. And I am scared to this day of clowns. Like, I know I could rewatch it.
I literally have that movie sitting next to me.
Oh, God.
It is on my desk right now.
It's so scary. Like, I was
funny.
so traumatized and horrified of Tim Curry in that movie. It scared the shit out of me. What about you?
Well, technically Scream, but I don't really remember it.
Mm-hmm.
I had to have been, I think that movie came out in 96. So I was probably like 6 or 7.
Oh my God.
I remember I had nightmares afterwards for sure, but I actually don't really remember watching the movie. But the first one I remember vividly is Psycho.
Oh.
And my mom rented it for me, and I was probably like 9 or so. And
that is still young.
Well, I was really into like creepy things, and my mom could tell that I was really into it at a young age. And so she rented Psycho for me and kind of taught me what she learned in a class that she took about the filmmaking and kind of the storytelling of it. And I fell in love with it immediately.
Oh, wow. That is extremely cool. Do you know how your mom knew all of this stuff? Did she...
She took a class in high school. Yeah, just in high school, and she found it really interesting, and she just remembered a handful of things to let me know and to kind of like start off my horror movie journey.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's a good one because she isn't wrong. There are some film innovations in that movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember watching it at my grandma's house, like had to like hone in the basement of my grandma's house to watch it all.
What? Oh God, in a basement? You're watching Psycho in a basement?
Yep.
Oh man.
I was a creepy kid.
That's scary to me. I was just a big baby and always have been about horror movies. I'm like, I can't handle it. And it's like, Kelly, it's just a movie. And I'm like, I'm going to think about it for the rest of my life.
Oh, I love them.
Well, it's funny, too, because scary books do not have the same effect on me. So every spooky season, I pick a scary book to read. And I don't remember what it was last year, but...
It was Dr. Sleep last year, because I know I gave it to you. It was scary.
That is because I had read The Shining for one of my spooky season books. And you were like, you have to read Dr. Sleep.
It's such a good book, but it's intense early on.
Yeah, that's what you said. At the beginning, it's rougher. But it was. I remember reading a certain stretch of dialogue in there that I was like, whoa! But, Stephen King... Yeah, Stephen King's books always have something in them that you're like, that's a little weird because it's a horror book, you know?
Yep.
Okay, are you ready to hear some shit?
I'm very ready. As you said, we've talked about this a lot, but not in like super, super great detail. Right. And I have seen articles like pop up in my feed where I'm like, I can't read this. So
I know.
I'm very anxious to talk about this.
I know. And you guys, it's all happening very, very recently, which is why Sam's seeing articles right now, because some of this stuff just happened. As in, after we recorded the Katie Gallagher episode, the day after that, a huge article was published with so many more details about Katie's case. And then we'll go on. And when I researched and we discussed the death of Katie Gallagher, I wanted to pull the thread a little bit more on this one. So strap in, because I have an update, and then there are two cases in one.
I also see what you did. Pull the thread.
Yeah.
You got it.
The reason I wanted to do another episode is I discovered during my research on Katie's death that it was one of a particular string with Kenwood Allen charged, but there was a completely separate string of drug-facilitated deaths occurring in the city. This pattern stands independently of Katie's, but I wanted to hear more. We'll first lead off with an update on Katie's case. If you missed the Katie Gallagher episode, she was an up-and-coming fashion designer shown at New York Fashion Week, and she was murdered in a drug-facilitated death. Investigators have charged Kenwood Allen. Katie was drugged and overdosed on July 4th, 2022, so just over a little of a year ago. And Katie's murder was part of one distinct pattern, and it was a much more violent pattern, with suspects offering tainted drugs to victims in clubs before stealing money, jewelry, and cell phones for money transfers. And some of these robberies are just straight up brute force street muggings outside or near clubs for jewelry and cash. On March 30th, 2023, so this spring, a grand jury was impaneled to look into the death of 35-year-old Catherine Marie Gallagher. She was discovered dead in her Lower East Side home in July 2022. Her death had been ruled a homicide March 23rd, 2023. So, some time there. And the Manhattan District Attorney's Office said investigation into Katie's death is ongoing. And you'll be excited to hear this, Sam, because we talked about this a lot in the episode. That one of the things we weren't able to do was find clarity on where Katie was drugged. Well.
Oh, yes. I'm very interested in this.
Yes. So we have, it's sort of just a scrap. It doesn't fully explain it that much. But just a day after our episode aired, it came out August 29th, 2023. ABC News published that Gallagher was allegedly drugged outside her apartment in what police say was an attempted robbery.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we now know Katie was in fact drugged in the parking lot. That's what that seems to imply to me, outside her apartment, you know? So I still have questions. There's still some stuff to be picked at here. Like, I would guess that the means of using the cocktail of drugs that showed up in Katie's system, including high levels of the potent opioid fentanyl, was maybe powder put on a rag or some kind of injectable. Though injectable, you might be a lot less likely to know where you're stabbing in a dark parking lot. And injecting it would very likely have been deadly no matter where it entered your system. And I'm still searching for clarity on this. I imagine as the investigation unfolds in court, the prosecution will address it, I hope.
Yeah, I actually made a phone call to my friend who's the medical examiner after we did the Katie Gallagher episode, because there were still so many questions. And I'm like, yes. I need at least some insight that you might be able to give me.
What did they say?
And I know we were talking a lot about p-fentanyl in combination with fentanyl. And what she told me is that's incredibly common.
Okay.
P-fentanyl cuts fentanyl. So it makes it less potent from my understanding. And that's obviously used to spread the drug out further for distribution. So immediately she's like, yes, that's normal. You're not really gonna find just fentanyl, especially on the streets. So
well, that makes
that
sense.
clarified a lot for me.
Yeah.
But I also just kind of asked, and I guess it really doesn't matter now that we have the fact that we know where she was drugged. But I asked, like, is it possible that it could have been dropped into a drink and have her walk home a couple blocks or whatever and struggle? Because my big thing that I was super, super stuck on was her struggling to get into her apartment.
Yes.
That to me was like she would already been drugged at this point. Her neighbor noticed this struggle, which seemed out of character and out of the norm to mention it.
Yeah, what for me is confusing is if she was struggling with the door, wouldn't the neighbor have noticed some sort of intoxication on her part? I don't know. Maybe he did, and that's why he mentioned it.
Well, I think that's what the struggle was. What the struggle itself was the intoxication. And maybe she had the ability to articulate enough where he wouldn't necessarily get it verbally, but her motor skills were certainly struggling.
Right. But also then wouldn't you just say, like, somebody just drugged me to your neighbor? Or like, or if it was dropped in a drink, we just don't know.
Yeah, there's so many questions. But you're right. Like, if she got drugged outside, did she not know?
Right.
But if there was an attempted robbery outside and then she's struggling to get inside, wouldn't she say, like, someone just tried to rob me? I have so many questions that are unanswered.
I know. And it's, I hope, addressed. And also, Katie's parents even recently said in this article that she was a great fashion designer. Though she was a great fashion designer, she was still struggling to make rent and had little to steal. So it's so senseless.
But I will say, at this point, like, I think a lot of the general public probably doesn't know that she was struggling to make rent because of her publicized success.
Right.
So somebody trying to rob her, she might seem like a fantastic target.
Right. But little did they know that most of Katie's finances are usually tied up in her next fashion line that we mentioned during her episode. She financed her own shows at New York Fashion Week, which is incredibly expensive. So most of her expenses were usually tied up in that next show. And so you're right. These people might have been like, she looks like a really good target, that's a fashionable bag or anything, might have triggered them to think that she was worth robbing.
Or if they just even actually knew who she was and that she was a famous designer, but they don't know the fashion world. I didn't know that all of her money would have been tied up in the shows until you told me in the episode.
No, yeah. And I had no idea either until I researched the episode. I was like, oh, I didn't know that was common. But Kenwood Allen, I'm sure all he allegedly wanted was her credit cards and ID so he could steal her identity. Police initially told Gallagher's parents she had died of an overdose prior to it being ruled drug-facilitated theft. And the family went on the record saying this didn't make sense to them. Katie's mom, Deborah, said, "When I heard the overdose thing, all these things went through my mind. Like, is there something I don't know about my daughter? How could this be true?" End quote.
Yeah, which unfortunately isn't an uncommon thing either. I think a lot of kids don't tell their parents about drug use, whatever age they are.
Yeah, and however much they're consuming, even if it's like a little bit or if it's a lot, it can be something that you absolutely don't necessarily advertise to your family. But, of course, we know now that their gut instinct was right, that this was not...
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, like they said, listen, I know my kid and this wouldn't happen. And we see that a lot coming up as well, which is really great because you just have people who won't let these stories go, which is what we need.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
At this time, Kenwood Allen is still awaiting charges of second-degree murder for Katie's death. However, it has also come to light that one of his accomplices has been charged as well. This is all from that article that came out right after we released that episode.
Yeah, I think I read like the first couple paragraphs and then we got into the conversation of like doing the follow-up. I'm like, I have to stop. But I got to this point. I'm like, I really want to keep reading.
Yeah. So the accomplice is named Sean Shirley, and he is 26 years old. Shirley is not yet charged with Katie's murder, but has been charged as a party to Allen's murders, robberies, and larceny charges.
Okay, so that could come later still.
Exactly. They might still be waiting to hit him with a murder charge until they can prove he was there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But he's already being charged as an accessory to at least his robberies and larceny.
Yeah, because I was kind of thinking when we first saw this, like, I really didn't go past seeing his name, but knowing a second person was there.
Yeah.
My
Makes
thought
sense,
was maybe
right?
she was drugged at a bar by this guy and then ran into Alan outside her apartment, which was caught on camera.
Uh-huh.
But we know that's not specifically the case necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily, but it's like, you know, there's no real pieces yet, but I know that they're holding on to certain things and that we will learn certain stuff just because of how these other cases went that I'm going to talk about. And everything that we're talking about with Kenwood Allen and Sean Shirley all stems from 26 alleged robberies that occurred between March and December of 2022. So in this string, in Katie's string, there are 26 alleged robberies.
That's almost once a week.
Yeah.
Like, that's what, 9 months? 26 is 6 months? Like, that's almost once a week.
I know. Isn't it crazy? And it's exactly like, so this is just the one string, but we're going to keep talking about the new things. The last time we recorded, I wasn't sure if Kenwood Allen had retained counsel, but I do have an update that both Allen and Shirley have representation and did not respond to ABC News requests for comment. So,
which we assumed that they would.
Yeah. They're going to lawyer up. And I've seen nothing about what plea the men have entered, but I imagine it'll be published shortly. Deborah Gallagher had a simple statement for the charged criminals saying, "I can't forgive right now. Maybe in time. I even told the priest that. I'm sorry, but I just can't do it right now. Our daughter, her whole future, our future with her. How could you forgive that?" End quote. It's a poor family.
Yeah. I'm asking the same question. Like, how could you forgive it if I'm putting myself in her shoes?
Yeah.
And then on top of it, also knowing all of these other crimes were part of this same two people.
Yeah, to know, like, I bet they did the same exact thing you did, which was they did the math in their heads, and they were like, oh my God, how long have these guys been operating before they killed my child? You know?
Yeah.
And
how many other people could have died from this or did die?
Yes, exactly. And that's why I put the note in there that her case is still under investigation, because authorities are still actively pursuing additional cases into this. So these charges, even that I read here, might be upgraded at any time with another case that they feel they have a strong connection on. So I'm keeping my ear to the ground. And that's what's been published as of now, though I'm following Katie's case closely, so closely that I wanted to look into the other pattern of drug-facilitated deaths in the city.
Yeah, I'm curious if this is all connected in some way or another.
I'm interested. I talk a little bit about that, about our conversations that we've had about it and how they might be linked in a moment that will all come through. But this string of robberies, it's wild. From March 2022 to December 2022, clubgoers in New York City were found to be waking up in cold back seats or on cold floors, or even worse, they weren't waking up at all due to the overdose of drugs given to them by rings of criminals who would then rob their bank accounts. So we're going to widen our scope of our story from just the string of druggings responsible for Katie's death, as more have happened at a startling rate in this pattern. So, a second pattern. 2 other victims' families have chosen to speak out. The deaths would be similar, but show an entirely different pattern than Alan and Shirley's cases, and they have been determined by investigators to be unrelated.
See, like that's interesting to me because immediately from your first sentence there, it's the same dates, March 2022
Yes.
to December 2022.
Yes. And so the idea, I don't know, I'm not an investigator, but they determined it's unrelated. And to have 2 robbery crews both using fentanyl in this way in the exact same time period, I think they're investigators right now might just be like, well, the MO is wrong. This is different. And it's like, well, we don't know if these are 2 robbery crews who've each been given the same orders and maybe aren't aware of each other, which we've discussed a little bit off air.
Yeah, like they're running independently from each other, but they've been told to do the same thing in their circles.
And what I mentioned later down in the script, but I'll mention it right now instead because we're talking about it. I'll address it shortly. So, yeah, it's been determined to be unrelated, but yeah, we've talked off air, and like we just said, maybe they're operating independently of each other, and they've just been given the same orders. Later down the script, Sam and I have been talking about this a lot off air, and we're thinking that each of these robbery crews may have the same supplier. And I think that, and I think, Sam, you kind of agree with me, that there are only but few that can get a lot of the horrific opioid fentanyl. And like we were talking about, we don't think that somebody with the money for that amount of drugs to have sat on a huge supply would be getting his hands dirty on the street. I think he's sending these crews out. And then this is crazy. The aggregate number of cases stands at 43 druggings and 7 overdoses connected to the 2 patterns. 43 druggings and 7 deaths.
So much.
That is insane. That's so many.
I do think that fentanyl is unfortunately much more common than it was 5-10 years ago. But I do think, like, okay, a lot of people can probably get their hands on it if they really tried. Like, you hear about fentanyl overdoses all the time, unfortunately. But what gets me so specifically is this is a really weird way to rob people.
Yes.
And 2 independent groups coming up with this idea is really bizarre to me.
Right. That would be wild to me as well. That they both just spontaneously were like, the best way to rob somebody would be to drug them with fentanyl. That doesn't seem
in the exact same 9-month period.
Yeah. So
that's what seems weird to me.
I agree. I'm totally with you on there. But regardless, they've taken 2 shapes with these 2 different robbery crews. And like we just said, the druggings and robberies were happening at a startling rate. Another 26 robberies are linked to this separate pattern from Katie's. And they occurred between March 18th, 2022 and December 8th, 2022. On March 3rd, 2023, the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner ruled that the deaths of 2 men who died after they were drugged and beaten at gay clubs in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City declared them homicides. We can also say with reasonable logic that the deaths of these 2 men were different perpetrators, as Katie was not beaten and not in Hell's Kitchen.
Yeah, and just like being out to nightclubs versus on your way home for the evening when it wasn't even too late at night.
Right. And one of the reasons I say this is largely because of the fact that these 2 men were beaten, and we know that Alan and Shirley didn't typically beat their victims, or at least Katie was not beaten. So, different MOs there. And both victims we will now discuss, Julio Ramirez and John Umberger's deaths, were ruled homicides as well. This was due to both men being given drugs that were tainted with fentanyl, according to the police. And on March 30th, 2023, through the investigation, it was determined that these were 2 distinctly different patterns in the druggings and robberies. No one suspect is believed to have been involved with all the druggings, according to ABC7 New York. So I don't think that no one suspect is believed to be involved with all the druggings, but I still think exactly what we said before, that there's still 2 groups of people who have perhaps been given the same orders.
Yeah, or more, unfortunately. Like it's probably not just these 4 people total. But
no, absolutely not.
Yeah, it's too bizarre. Too bizarre and too similar to each other.
Right.
To happen in that time period.
Although the patterns first gained public attention following the 2 deaths connected to the Hell's Kitchen gay bars, the patterns involve a mix of both straight and gay bars and of both heterosexual and LGBTQ people. Multiple suspects are still being looked at in each of these patterns, and I would venture a guess that up to this very day of recording, they are still exploring many others that face charges for these deaths.
Yeah, I doubt this is kept to just a couple people.
Oh yeah, I doubt it as well. And in the Umberger Ramirez string, there are 17 cases of robberies and druggings out of that 43. So we thought we'd expand the narrative outward to their stories as well. In this pattern, the drunk victims are offered tainted narcotics or marijuana at a bar. Once the drugs take effect, they are robbed of their cell phones, and large amounts of money are transferred from the victims' bank accounts to these perpetrators.
That's another thing that I forgot to mention earlier. In Katie's case, like, the conversation was that money would be transferred, and that was the goal with other robberies. Yep. Where's that money going? Yep. And who, like, how are they making it so it's not an clear as day obvious, transfer this money into this bank account. That bank account is registered to this person. Like, is it something that's like an offshore account?
I will say that at first, through my research, I gleaned that at first the police were keen to just keep these as like run-of-the-mill overdoses. But the families pressed and pressed after discovering their loved ones were missing huge amounts of money.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they had to pressure people to take a second look at this.
And I hate to say it, that's not a terrible, like, plan if you are a robber, is to have these people's deaths just look like standard overdoses. And not investigated as a murder.
And again, how unique is that thought? You know?
Yeah.
How could these, like, 2 independent separate groups totally had that one unique thought about transferring money? Because Kenwood Allen and his now announced accomplice always went to, like, maxing out the credit cards and identity theft. So, but also I imagine that would have required a lot of transfers of money to their accounts. So, like, that's just another very unique detail that both of them share. And that leads me to think that maybe someone's giving them the same instructions.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit too about where the money went in this case that made me have some question marks too. I was like, huh?
Yeah, I'm very interested in like the paper trail of the money.
Me too. And I imagine that it wasn't even explored until these families were like, no, this is not right. This is not right at
Hmm.
all.
Which, thank goodness, those families were able to identify that sort of stuff, because as an adult, your
Absolutely.
families might not be able to. They might not know what to look for.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And thank goodness these families knew that. So we'll first turn our attention to the case of Julio Ramirez, which is heartbreaking. And haven't you read a little bit about this one?
I have. I actually, this was in that beginning of that article that you sent me that I had to stop reading. But
Uh huh.
I remember this had to have been probably a month after he died. I read an
Mm-hmm.
article that was from his brother, saying that he didn't believe that this was an overdose and this it wasn't ruled homicide at that point. But I
Correct.
vividly
Yes.
remember reading an article where his brother was interviewed.
Yes. His brother's name is Carlos, and we're going to talk about him a little more because he was interviewed. And that's another reason I say it's heartbreaking because Julio was so clearly loved by everyone around him. And it's truly our loss that we won't see him grow and thrive to do all the good he was capable of. Because he was doing postgraduate work studying public health and social work. So he would have done so much good, you know?
Yeah, I remember that article, his brother kind of going through those sorts of things and
Mm-hmm.
using that in the conversation of like he doesn't do drugs in this way
Mm-hmm.
because these are the
Mm-hmm.
things he wants to do with his life.
Right. And so while we're talking about him, we'll share that what has been shared about Julio has come from his brother Carlos. And he said in the spring of 2023, Ramirez would have been in his second year studying public health and postgraduate work and hoping to be a social worker. And his brother imagines that he would have moved from Brooklyn to Manhattan, which was something he'd been planning to do, and that he'd be traveling and, quote, just living his life.
Which somebody at that age, at that point in your life, that's exactly what you want to be doing.
Exactly. You just want that for these people. These people deserve that. And this is even more heartbreaking. On days when she's missing Ramirez, Karenina Quimpo says she surrounds herself with sunflowers, which were Julio's favorite, and she listens to music by Taylor Swift, which the pair bonded over.
No.
Yeah, she added that she still sends Ramirez funny memes on Instagram and talks to him out loud, despite knowing he cannot answer.
Hmm. And I think that's
Quote,
very common and both heartwarming and heartbreaking
mm-hmm,
at the same time.
exactly. And she said, quote, obviously it's awful to be without him, and there are days where I'll be missing him so much and I won't stop crying, but then I'll remember that that's not what he would have wanted, she said. She went on, if he's watching, he's trying to tell me, like, chill, keep living your life, end quote. And I said, this is just so tragic and awful. I feel terrible for Julio's friends and family who clearly loved him and pursued justice for him no matter what. It's so sad that Carlos has been denied more time with his brother who deserved to live. And Karenina sending his page memes still is beautiful. The hardest thing can be knowing your loved one would want you to go on without them.
Yeah.
And this is some Shit, this is some heavy. Julio was just 25 years old.
Yeah, so young.
So young. And he was just out for a night at the Ritz Bar and Lounge on April 21st, 2022. He was drugged and lost his life in the back of a cab after he was seen leaving the bar with 3 men. So, I think we might be able to assume that Julio was drugged in the club. I don't know if the men he was leaving with were supporting him to the cab and then left. I think that that's extremely likely from what all the research I've done, that the men were probably keeping him upright a little bit, because it's said later on the pattern is that they would get them at the club and perhaps drug them there and then take them to a second location.
Oh, a second location.
Right.
Interesting.
So it was often, so that's how they think Julio ended up here in the back of this cab. And we'll talk a little bit more about the other victim and where he was found as well. And so, yes, taking them to a second location is in all these.
Like an apartment, you're thinking, or somewhere else?
Well, in this case, it was a cab, and in our next victim's case, it was an apartment.
Oh, you're referring to the cab as a second location.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they were caught on surveillance footage with them going with him from the club to the cab.
Okay, that makes more sense. I thought you meant there was another place in between the two of those.
No. So what I'm guessing is it wasn't stated what condition he was in the surveillance video, but I think it's entirely plausible that these men were like supporting him to get him to the cab as he was overdosing.
Right, and trying to look like good friends, trying to get their buddy home.
Right. And anybody who watched the surveillance footage might be like, okay, well, he's just really drunk because they were just at a bar.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. And considering he was the only one in the back of the cab when he died, whoever was with him left him for dead in a New York City cab.
Yeah.
Like, that is outrageous. And after his body was found, Carlos Ramirez, Julio's brother, who we mentioned, he was in shock and disbelieving as the police told him his brother Julio had died of an overdose. In April 2022, Carlos Ramirez spoke with Nightline and said that, quote, police said it was an accidental overdose and that, that it was hard to prove that someone had did this to him. However, Carlos was adamant about his brother's death, saying, quote, I knew for a fact that, someone did this to him.
Yeah, it was probably around that time that I was reading that article. It was probably on like NBC or something.
Right.
That I was reading.
Right.
But I remember vividly, the article stuck with me because I read so much throughout a day that it's not difficult for me to confuse articles or kind of forget bits and details. But I vividly remember this article because it was so sad. And he was so adamant about this was not his brother's personality to be in this situation.
Yes, he was like, I know my brother, which, again, applause to these families who said they know their family member and that this would not happen. Mm-hmm. And so, it was April 2022 when he first spoke with Nightline, and that was the same month Julio was drugged. And so, again, just a year and some change ago, you would have seen that article. So it doesn't, and it doesn't surprise me it stuck with you because these are so sad.
Well, and being over a year ago, about a year and a half ago, the fact that I still remember all of those details when you sent me that article I read a few paragraphs of, 2 weeks ago? Mm-hmm. And I immediately remembered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you did remember. You were like, I know this case. I've read a little bit about it, and now I have to stop.
Yeah, I'm like, it was that moment where I'm like, I already know too much. Like, I want to not know the details when we go into this recording.
Right. And so, for more details, 3 days after Julio's death, Julio's family was told by police that 3 days after his death, his bank accounts were drained.
Oh, so it took a little bit of time for them to do that.
Yeah, in this case, the family, I'm not sure if they didn't notice it and the police did first, but at least in the case of our next victim, the family noticed it first and told police.
Yeah, I guess that would probably depend on who has access to the accounts. Because it might take them a little bit of time to get access from the banks or the credit card companies to do that in like the paperwork following a death to get other people access. That might take a little bit of time.
Yeah, and for the cops, it's probably quicker because, like, 3-day window, it probably took him just 3 days to look at his bank account.
Yeah, and that's easy to get the access through a warrant or whatever is required.
Absolutely.
In that sort of situation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so they told the family his bank accounts were drained. There were also multiple drugs found in his system, including the powerful opioid fentanyl. So again, that link there. The family said police told them Julio left in a taxi with a group of men who abandoned his body in the back of the car on the Lower East Side soon after. Julio was declared dead roughly 90 minutes after he left the bar, and his family said they then discovered money taken from his accounts after he died. Okay, so the family did notice it.
So I wonder if those guys, those three men that were putting him in the cab, did they tell the cab driver an address? Because I feel like 90 minutes is a long period of time to be in the back of a cab. And granted, you're probably, as the cab driver, it's probably a decent amount less than that because you have to discover he's not alive, call the police, get medical response. Like, there's time in there. You can cut that 90 minutes down. But that's still a pretty long cab ride in what is likely the middle of the night. Like, it is New York. There's still going to be traffic, but it's a long ride.
And again, like the cab driver, maybe he thought for a little while, like, oh, this guy, they put him in a cab after leaving a bar. He's probably so fucked up. And then he just didn't look but again, you can cut that 90 minutes down with him eventually looking and seeing this guy is not moving, not breathing. So,
well, my immediate assumption, and this is just an assumption, there's no evidence on it, is he probably got to the location, the address that he was told to go to, whether it was by Julio himself or these three guys, and then said, get out of the car, and then he wasn't moving, and that's my just gut instinct thought at that point.
Yeah, that's certainly possible.
Which is one reason I wonder who told him the address.
Yes. Yeah. I wonder as well, because the next few things I'm going to mention make me question at what point the driver was told where to go. Because ultimately, Ramirez's bank account was drained of approximately $20,000 using facial recognition access on his phone, relatives said.
Oh, so okay. Well, I was just going to say, like, the 3 days after the death. So the money wasn't withdrawn 3 days after. It was discovered 3 days after.
3 days.
Okay.
Yes.
I thought it was meaning that the money, like, they held on to the account numbers or whatever. And 3 days later, they took the money out. Okay. Interesting.
So, yeah. The transfers happened through apps such as Venmo and Zelle, and his credit cards were later maxed out on expensive dinners and spa services.
Huh. Venmo and Zelle, you feel like you'd trace that so easily.
Right? You would think. That's what I thought. And I find this to be incredibly disturbing on a number of levels because what it implies to me is that the robbers almost surely used his face as he was passing out on the verge of death without them caring that that was the case.
Yeah.
So that's so horrific. And it's also nothing short of disgusting that these perpetrators were just going out to fancy dinners and spa services. Like, that must have just caused Ramirez's family even more pain, which clearly these men don't care about at all. It is vile.
Well, you might want to cut this out, but my immediate thought with dinners and spa services is, what if this is a whole lot bigger and there's sex workers or people being trafficked?
Yeah.
And that's what the money's going for? Like, I don't know if you want to include this in the episode, but...
No. I do, because I was thinking to myself as well, like, oh, dinners and spa services? So, like, how many? And who were you dating that you had to go that many times? And then it immediately led my brain in the same direction. Like, is there somebody using his credit cards for dinner and spa services to make these sex workers like him? I don't know. But I thought about the same thing. Because I was like, those are pretty specific.
Yeah, and I'm also just so hung up on Venmo and Zelle. Because maybe I just don't know it well, or
so
maybe I'm just using it right because that's how it's supposed to be used.
No.
But, like, don't you need that tied to a specific bank account?
Right, or phone number. So it surprises me. Like I said, a ton of this was brought forward by the families, and that surprises me that, like, you can't track that kind of, like, what phone number did it go to? Trace that phone number. You know, I don't know if it's as easy as that.
Yeah, see that I'm thinking it is, but it might not be.
It was one of those things too that it bothered me. I was like, well, to do Venmo or Zelle, you have to have a recipient logged in your...
And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Zelle only done through Chase Bank? Or is that actually, other banks?
Zelle is a larger company. They just partner with Chase.
Okay. I've only ever heard about it with people who have Chase. So that's the reason, like, I think it's Chase. I don't really know.
Yeah, they partner with Chase, but they are bigger. I don't know who else they partner with. But again, I'm wondering, I have so many questions here about this paper trail.
Yeah.
And so Julio's cause of death remained listed as pending until roughly March 2023.
Oh, wow. Almost a year. Well, just about a year.
Yes. And the New York City Medical Examiner's Office ruled Ramirez's death as a homicide caused by drug-facilitated theft. The office said that multiple drugs were found in his system, again, including fentanyl, lidocaine, and cocaine.
Oh, interesting.
So he was given a cocktail. Yeah. In approximately April of 2023, Ramirez's family finally was given the toxicology report for Julio. So it took nearly a year for them to get the information, and it confirmed that Carlos was in fact right. His brother's death had been ruled a homicide.
Yeah, that's a weird cocktail. Like, I guess maybe I just don't know.
It's a weird cocktail.
But the lidocaine, like, thrown in there, it's like isn't that like a topical numbing?
Yes,
am I
from
right
what
in
I
that?
understand. No, from what I understand, it's a local anesthetic of the amino acid amide type, and is used to treat certain things, but it's also used for local anesthesia or nerve blocks.
I've heard of it, like, used a lot by dentists. And I've also heard
yes.
people like who are getting like an intense tattoo get a lidocaine shot. Like that's my knowledge of it. But
so it's another
weird.
anesthetic. So another sedative that would have inhibited him.
I have a thought, but it's kind of odd. But it could make sense for Katie Gallagher. I don't know how lidocaine is necessarily given. I'm not sure if it could be like a topical wipe or if it has to be a shot. I know it can be a shot. But what if they numb an area and then shoot you with a syringe? So that could have been her not knowing, because she might not have actually felt the syringe of the fentanyl.
Exactly. And I just took a peek here too. The Mayo Clinic says lidocaine does come in a topical jelly or ointment, and it's used on different parts of the bodies to cause numbness or loss of feeling for patients having medical procedures.
Like they could have done like a sleight of hand, like how how people can like steal a wallet or something, but with like a little bit of that on their fingers, like I don't know.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it could have been a sleight of hand thing and just rubbed it into her hand or her arm, and
that's pure speculation, but
stick her.
It's just getting my mind whirling.
No, fully speculation on my end too, but it does make sense. But I don't recall Katie's autopsy results having lidocaine in her system.
It's weird. And it's like you have to be really good at sleight of hand to be able to do that and then administer a shot in that spot. Like, that does seem like a long shot. Like, this might be the opposite of Occam's razor here. But it's just the thought that came to my head.
Because, it's also allegedly happening in a dark parking lot. So, like, how would you know where you rubbed it and you're stabbing in the same area? But again, anywhere you injected this, I think it might have still, done catastrophic damage.
Yeah, it's just her getting upstairs, not mentioning it to the neighbor. Like, that's all so bizarre to me.
Right. It all tracks if you were, like, numb. And, like, maybe, who knows? Maybe they were even sat at a bar and she was sat behind them and somebody pretended to run into her and ran their hand down the back of her arm. We don't know. Because if it was topically applied, I don't know if it shows in toxicology. That would be a very good question.
Let me write that down. I'll call my medical examiner friend tomorrow and see what she says.
Yeah. Because I just wonder.
Yeah, I'm definitely writing that down.
So on April 21st, 2023, Ramirez's family and friends gathered at his parents' home to conclude a novena prayer, which takes place over 9 consecutive days. They plan to spend time together watching home movies of Ramirez and looking through old photographs, they said. Quote, "This weekend, of course, will be a weekend of mourning, but also to celebrate how far this trial has come and how much we still remember him," Quimpo said. "And how people are still following his story because they know that justice still needs to be served," end quote. And I think that is a very good way to sum this up. We don't want to let the story go because all these victims deserve the justice of their murderers being behind bars.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of what we were mentioning before with Katie Gallagher's family. It's tragic that this happened to her, but when you think about it in the grander scheme of all of this, there's so many more people who are so negatively affected. It needs to stop.
Right. And to have everything still ongoing in both strings of investigations, that would mean that they think there are additional victims in both. So I imagine they're still trying to attach certain cases to these same crews of robbers.
Yeah, and what's probably really hard with that is there very potentially could be victims who are drug users where this wouldn't necessarily seem out of character. And they need to analyze all of those as well.
Right. Or they may have been drunk at the bar and they didn't remember, and then they still just got their stuff stolen and were like, oh, I'll cancel my card. And they haven't thought yet, oh, these were the same guys because they were drunk. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. They could have thought it would be a typical like credit card theft. Like that's unfortunately happened to me a handful of times where somehow electronically my credit card numbers get stolen and I need to cancel my cards and get new ones. Like, I'm quite positive I've never been in a situation where I've been drugged and had them stolen, but that's incredibly possible for, especially if there's people that's kind of their lifestyle where they go out and drink and party and just kind of happens.
Right. So like I said, yeah, they're both strings of robberies and druggings are still open, and we'll provide a tip line number at the end of the episode. I have that written down. But the Ramirez family does feel, though, that there's some kind of justice being served now that men await trial for Julio's murder.
Oh, good.
Carlos Ramirez said, quote, I'm glad we can go to sleep tonight and that all of the people responsible for Julio not being here are off the street. Like, that's the sliver of relief. This year has been really hard because there were times where I felt hopeless, according to Carlos.
Well, I was just going to say, like, having all of these details and knowing that there's a lot of other victims involved in this, that has to be a good sense of relief, even though obviously you're still heartbroken that your brother's not here. Also, side note, I texted a medical examiner friend asking if a topical lidocaine would show up on toxicology. The answer is no.
Okay. Oh, snap. Well, then that supports what we were just talking about. Who knows then?
I feel like that is kind of a long shot. Like that's kind of a crazy theory, but interesting.
Yeah, and what I wonder is why the lidocaine showed up in Julio, but not in Katie. Like, did they inject him with it and it was in his system? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it probably would have had to be in a syringe or maybe a pill form or something. I don't know how it all works, but it would have had to be ingested at that point, it sounds like. Interesting. I'm glad we got a quick answer.
Yeah, thank you. And so a team of robbery suspects has been charged with Julio's murder, and we are going to discuss them at the end because they are also suspects in another man's overdose. We'll turn now to yet another victim, John Umberger. And some say this case is the one directing attention to this string of druggings because his mother, Linda Clary from Atlanta, flat out refused to believe that her son died of an accidental overdose after a night on the town in June of 2022. She was described by one source as, quote, loudly doing it, loudly refusing to believe it. And I have to say, good for her. Good. If people are describing you as loudly proclaiming what you know to be true, I think you've succeeded. And in some measure, Linda Clary has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. If that's the adjective given to you for this, you're clearly making your voice heard.
John Umberger was a political consultant who was in New York City for work purposes. And he went out to enjoy a night at the Q NYC, a gay bar on 795 8th Street. His credit card was used at around 3 a.m. at the club, and a group of men were seen on surveillance video leading him into a car outside the bar. And he was last seen an hour later on surveillance camera with 3 unidentified men in a car outside the Upper East Side townhouse where he was staying. So, we could probably assume, we can't really assume he was drugged in his apartment or he was drugged at the club. I'm not sure because there's not much released on what state he was in these recordings. Like, were they supporting him to walk?
Right.
I don't know.
It's interesting that it's 3 men in both his in the videos of him and Julio, and only 2 men have been arrested.
Oh, no. We're gonna get there.
Okay.
We're gonna get there. My thought would be, again, maybe I just don't know. I don't know enough about these drugs and about how long it takes them to kick in. But if he was drugged inside the club, I thought it might be visible on that security footage from his building. But again, people could have just assumed, like, oh, he was out drinking. He's probably drunk and these guys brought him home. When in fact, it was the exact opposite.
I did ask my friend, medical examiner, and my sister, who is a first responder, about potentially how long it would take. And we were very specifically talking Katie Gallagher in this conversation.
Yeah.
But each answer was, it just really depends on the person with how long it could take for the drug to kick in. Obviously, it could be fairly quickly. But if they were drug users and had a higher tolerance, it could definitely take longer. It might take more.
I'm not sure either of John Umberger's height and weight.
That's a big factor.
Yeah, maybe they had given it to him at the club and it just hadn't hit him yet.
Yeah, and it's also like the combination of the drugs. We know this is a cocktail, but what's the balance between them?
Yes.
And when I asked them both, the answer was just really, really inconclusive. They couldn't give me any detailed information on it.
That's fair. You know, there's a lot of factors here. And that's why we're talking about it. Because it's like, how did this happen?
Right.
Yeah, authorities initially told Umberger's mom that her son's death was an overdose, she said. But after reading NBC News' coverage of Julio Ramirez's death, and through her own maternal intuition, Clary said she knew her son's death was a homicide. She was able to glean just from reading what happened to Julio, and she thought it was connected. She said, quote, "Nothing made sense initially, and it was like, wait a minute, John would not have gotten so depressed that he would have done a bunch of drugs and overdose," Clary said. That's just not who John was. Speaking to ABC News, Linda is clearly suffering, and it's awful. She stated that last year when she learned of John's death, it was, quote, "It's the worst phone call that any mother can ever get and ever want to get. It's the greatest pain and anguish of anything."
Oh, I'm sure. And again, that speaks to just knowing your kids and knowing your family, and this is out of character.
Umberger was found dead in a New York City apartment at East 61st Street on June 1st, 2022, 4 days after he was seen on surveillance with the unidentified men. His cell phones and his credit cards were missing. More than $25,000 had been transferred out of his accounts through cash apps on his phone, such as Venmo and PayPal in this case. Linda Clary confirmed in total more than $200,000 had been stolen from Umberger's phone and credit cards.
Wow.
Police also stated that Umberger had fentanyl in his system.
It's interesting to me, like, this is a lot of money. And even like when it comes to credit cards, that's a lot of money for the average person to be able to have stolen from them. Not everyone has that much money either in cash or in potential credit card.
Yeah, because certain credit cards have limits. And
exactly.
So they literally probably went through every single avenue to max it out, I would imagine.
It's just interesting to me having, like, they've obviously been having success in this. They've gotten a lot of money. Because how much was it out of Julio? That I think you said 20,000.
Yes,
that's even a lot.
$200,000. Yeah, $20,000 is a lot.
Yeah, it's like, It's very curious to me that they're knowing who they're targeting. Is kind of what I'm getting at. They know they're getting people where they can get money out of them, and it's not the person who has a typical $5,000 or $10,000 limit on a credit card. Like, it's a lot more than that.
It's curious. Again, I have questions about the paper trail. I mean, I imagine all that paper trail is going to be used in the case against them.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Because I'm sure they have it of how many times it went to once they were able. I know at least on Zelle, through Chase QuickPay Zelle, you can send money to any phone number that you want.
Oh, really?
Yes. Yeah. So they probably put in their phone number. So I would hope that one of the first things you do is trace that phone number.
Right. And I know PayPal, at least back in the day, PayPal, you didn't have to have it tied to a bank account unless you were transferring that money out. So there might be other ways at that point. I thought Venmo, you had to have a bank account tied to it, but I could be wrong. But it is so interesting how they're doing this.
I know, isn't it though? And then another interesting detail is both Ramirez and Umberger's deaths were first disclosed by their family members rather than authorities. However, with all the families protesting the overdose declarations, it had brought a lot of public attention to the several patterns of druggings and robberies and the 7 deaths this had caused.
So you're saying that the families announced the deaths before the police ever did? Wasn't that the same with Katie Gallagher? Because it was like 8 months before the news came out, and it was her family who said it.
Yes. Correct.
Interesting.
Yes, another interesting detail. So it's like, I'm not trying to say that there's not good investigative work happening here. We'll hear in a little bit that there is. However, it seems like at first everybody was willing to just chalk these up to overdoses. And the families would not let it go. And I'm glad they didn't, because the city medical examiner's office then confirmed what Linda Clary always knew, that Umberger's death was caused by a drug-induced homicide, and a mixture of drugs similar to Julio's were found also in his system, the office said.
Interesting.
Yes. And I have another interesting, there's so many things in each of these paragraphs have something that I'm like, what? Interesting. Because
and I'm like, I feel like I need to come up with another adjective, but I'm like, it's just like my brain is boggled.
It's just interesting. Like, and also it's so horrifying already. Like, but it gets worse because by this time in June 2022, investigators had tracked an SUV, a red Dodge Durango, that was seen outside Umberger's apartment and led them to one of the alleged killers. What I don't know and what hasn't been published is who the Durango belongs to. It might not be surprising to y'all that there are several perpetrators in both Julio and John's murders. I also don't know many more details about it at all, truthfully, because it's only been published in one of the sources I consulted. However, it was by ABC News, so I feel it's highly likely it's true.
Yeah, ABC has a good enough reputation for us to rely on that frequently.
Absolutely. And okay, trigger warning, everybody, this is a little grim. ABC also published that investigators said the big break happened in the case when 2 cell phone videos were found showing Umberger as he lay dying.
Oh, I think I have heard about this.
Isn't that awful?
Yeah,
it's horrible.
And that's why it's like, it's terrifying, which is why you remember.
Exactly. And now I still have more questions, though, too, because which phone was it on? Which man's? Who is heard in that audio? You know, like, what? And I'm sure, again, all of that will come out in the trial, and they didn't put it in the indictment because it could be information they're wanting to use. And
what was the point of taking a video? Let alone
for God's
2 videos. Sake. Like, as a real conversation. Like, was it something where it's just like you're kind of sick in the head and you want to save this memory? Or is it something that you need to prove and show to people higher up the chain that you did your job?
Yeah. Right. Well, here's something a little horrible, too. On August 29th, 2023, Linda, John's mother, broke her silence and was understandably very distraught over this. She said it was difficult to process, and I can't believe how you could process any of that. It's so traumatic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Linda stated, quote, "They recorded the video of my child, my son John, dying. And not only do they record it and they do nothing, but they snicker in the background."
Oh, yeah, I don't like that.
The only term I can give it is absolutely wicked. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
Like, it's
like
so,
fun and
like,
games,
think,
but it's someone's life.
Yeah. Right. And so now that the medical examiner had ruled that the deaths of Julio and John were homicides, on March 3rd, 2023, detectives and prosecutors were able to open up pursuing charges against suspects under investigation in other deaths in this pattern. They would eventually charge the same men in both murders. Ramirez and Umberger were revealed by authorities on April 18th, 2023, as victims of a broader citywide robbery scheme that included the 17 incidents. Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, alongside Mayor Eric Adams and New York City Police Commissioner Keechant Sewell, announced the indictment of Jaquan Hamilton, 35, of Brooklyn, Robert DeMeo, 34, of Brooklyn, Jacob Barroso, 29, of New Britain, Connecticut, Andre Butts, 27, of Brooklyn, and Shane Hoskins, 30, of New York City. A sixth man, Eddie Ashley, was also charged in relation to the crimes and was already incarcerated, authorities said.
Okay, so I'm glad they got a lot of people that they seem to have connections to this. That's
Correct.
Good in my opinion, because I think that there's a lot of people involved. But I'm looking at all of these people's ages. I'm sitting here thinking like snickering at someone dying in front of you is a childish thing. These are all grown men.
Right.
Like, come on.
Grown men. Exactly. Grown men. So that makes you animals. Really.
Yeah.
You're an animal. Somebody's child, somebody's family member is dying in front of you and you're like, ooh, like what is going on in your head?
Yeah, that's disturbing. It's just all of it is, but just that extra layer.
Oh yeah. And it's like that. I'm sure, like I said, investigation into Katie's death is still ongoing. And I hope that maybe they even find more people linked to that, since right now they've only charged 2 people.
Mm-hmm. I'm very curious about that. Yeah.
Yeah, who knows who they might pursue. And the warrants were issued the afternoon of March 24th, 2023, for the arrest of Jacob Barroso, Jaquan Hamilton, and Robert DeMeo for second-degree murder. While all 6 men have been hit with charges of grand larceny and first-degree robbery, as well as conspiracy to drug and rob at least a dozen victims.
Okay, well, that makes sense to me that the 3 were charged for second-degree murder. They're probably the 3 on camera. Like, I'm speculating that, but they're probably the 3 on camera that shows them.
I'm speculating that. Yeah.
Putting these men into cabs.
Yes.
Because that then you can so clearly tie murder to that.
Yeah, I think you're 100% correct. I think that's exactly what's going on here.
And then the other people probably benefited financially from all of this.
Correct. Yeah, and helped, in some way or another. And we'll see here, too, what they did with the money shortly. And that'll be another reason why I'm sure they nailed these other people. Both Umberger and Ramirez were found to be victims of homicides caused by drug-facilitated thefts after Umberger left Q NYC bar and Ramirez left the Ritz Bar and Lounge. They're both gay nightclubs, the medical examiner found. Robert DeMeo was additionally charged with the murder of John Umberger. Charges also said both men were drugged at bars in Hell's Kitchen and were robbed using facial recognition technology on their phones and left for dead. Which, again, is extra chilling to me because you would have had to use their falling unconscious body.
And you know what? This makes me want to turn off facial recognition on my phone.
Doesn't it, though? Yeah.
like I'll go back to a passcode or
Yeah.
something, because this is terrifying.
This is horrifying. Like, what is going on here? Like, this is depraved. And you also have this horrid group dynamic. And all these people are just as wild and loony as each other. Or they wouldn't be leaving people for dead in cabs and benefiting from leaving people for dead in cabs.
Well, that's why it feels so much like, I don't want to necessarily tie the word gang to it, but that sort of kind of concept where it is a group of people who are willing, and this is a very generic definition of gang. I know that this is not accurate in the real definition of the word, but in the stereotypical definition, a group of people who are willing to potentially commit crimes together and have each other's backs. Like, in that most simple stereotypical definition, this is what it sounds like.
Right. And I think maybe the investigators are hesitating the same way you are, is calling it gang. And that's why they've called these robbery perpetrators crews, quote unquote, crews.
Yeah, that's probably a better way, because it's like, I don't want to like tie that specific stereotype to gangs, and just like lack of a better word.
Right. Yeah. And so I think they called them crews, and I was like, I wonder why they're doing it. And now as I heard you talking, I was like, oh, maybe they didn't want to say gangs.
Yeah, like,
or everybody.
The first saying it, I'm like, this is not the right word, but there's just something here.
Then there's so many charges in this case alone. Like the amount of stuff that these guys did, and they're racking up charges, because Andre Butts, who he was charged with robbery, identity theft, grand larceny, and conspiracy, and all of these are charges that Barroso and DeMeo also face. So Barroso and DeMeo are getting a lot of these charges tacked to them. So that makes me think. And I mean that they're pursuing only Robert DeMeo for Umberger's death says a lot. Shane Hoskins was also charged in March of 2023, and he was charged with robbery in connection to the cases. So that's saying there may be another role there of someone who just did the robberies. You know?
Yeah, it does really kind of sound like everyone has a role in this, that they're kind of repeating in each instance. Like, if those three were the three men that were on the cameras both times, there's probably other instances where they were the three men who were in charge of the person who they drugged.
Exactly. And isn't that so chilling? Like, that they're organized enough that they have these roles down. And now, with the indictment coming out, it describes several other crimes that were not previously disclosed by the police, including attacks on at least 3 people that prosecutors say were drugged and robbed by Barroso, Hoskins, and Butts before and after the deadly attack on Julio. We're going to hear more. This is some garbage. This is wild again. The indictment cites text messages among the attackers that suggest they frequented the Ritz, the Hell's Kitchen bar where Mr. Ramirez was last seen alive. Prosecutors said the crimes were carried out by what they called, quote, a crew, like we just said, of attackers who preyed on people in the gay nightlife district in Midtown Manhattan, slipping drugs to unsuspecting patrons and then leading them to a second location, sometimes their own homes, to rob them. So we talked about that a little bit before, that in this pattern, there's usually a second location.
Mm-hmm. And they probably, like, in reality, tried to be all buddy-buddy with this person to then not have a big argument to follow him home or something like that.
And so according to the indictment, it is plausible that John Umberger made it all the way back from the club without appearing affected on the surveillance footage.
Yeah, it's definitely possible.
And like I said before, I don't know what state Umberger appears in on the surveillance video. And again, I think perhaps he was being supported by the other men, but it hasn't been released. But also, again, he could have just been bigger and more difficult to drug, so it wasn't taking effect yet. Or they drugged him inside the apartment.
Or even if there's a situation like, hey, they become, like, quote unquote, buddies at the club, like, obviously they have a different intention, but saying, like, oh, hey, like, we got some other stuff on us. Do you want to go back to somewhere a little more private and try the stash that we have? Like, that's entirely possible as well.
Or early on, I mentioned this, that a lot of the times they were drugging the marijuana. Perhaps what they said was like, do you smoke at all? Do you want to go home? We have weed on us.
Yeah, because, like, people do it in the clubs all the time, but, like, you're not supposed to.
Right. So it was probably like a way for them to be like, oh, we're not supposed to do it here, but we could do it back at your place.
Yeah, like, let's go somewhere where we can, like, sit and chill and do that. Yeah.
So as of April 3rd, 2023, one suspect, Jaquan Hamilton, who's been implicated in a lot of this, he remained at large. However, he was eventually taken in on these charges.
Good.
I don't have the exact date when they caught him, but he, as of now, has been apprehended. And lawyers for the men did not respond to requests for comment on April 3rd, 2023.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, not shocking, right? The indictment accuses Butts, Barroso, and Hamilton of using financial apps to transfer $3,400 from Julio Ramirez's bank account to themselves. So they use their own numbers.
That's so... Yeah. Oh, it's dumb. Yeah, like, I'm glad they did it.
Isn't that dumb?
But it's dumb.
Isn't that dumb? So dumb. Yeah, that's dumb. And the indictment also said the men would communicate via text message and social media to plan their attacks.
Yeah.
Which is...
I'm so glad you all did this in this way so that there's such an easy trail to you. But you're not smart.
No. Like, and also, that is so horrific and disgusting that you would just be chatting via text or, like, social media, like, oh, let's go drug somebody again, get some cash. Like, what?
Yeah.
And they would also plan what they would buy with the stolen money, chat about whether to go to bars in the rain, and joke about rivalries within their group.
Oh, that's interesting. Rivalries in their group.
Right.
I have questions on that.
Interesting. Yes. And are they, like, joking around? Like, oh, I only got to be on the drugging team last time. I want to be on, who knows?
Well, that makes me wonder.
But it was clearly damaging.
Yeah, well, it makes me wonder, like, rivalries in their group. Is this, like, the term group could mean a whole lot in this context. But what if it is really kind of this bigger criminal kingpin figure, right? And the group is basically all of his little minions doing these things, and a rivalry in their group, meaning the other set of druggers.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. And I hope, again, it's one of the things that the prosecution addresses in this case, because I would like
I
I'd
hope
like
they
to know more.
address it. But I do feel like, given, like, saying all of that, again, that's 100% speculation. But you would think if that were the case, they wouldn't be so adamantly denying the connection between Katie's murder and these murders. Yeah. So, like, I'm probably very wrong on that, but interesting. Again, interesting.
Yeah, it's just, again, there's so many things in this case where I was like, interesting. You know? And so the group of men is charged in the indictment with identifying people walking out of bars or nightclubs with the intent of either incapacitating them or inhibiting their perception of their surroundings, the DA said. And then they would take their cell phones and credit cards, conducting money transactions and dividing the proceeds between them. So these guys are really dumb. Like, they wired it to each other. Like, everybody's wired in on this. Like, what? Yeah.
And another thing I just thought of, and again, this, you might want to cut this out. This is just a super random thought. If they were to get their cell phones and have it open with the facial recognition, is it even something where it's like they potentially program their own face in it? So that will be the facial recognition for any of their apps?
I don't know when it comes to Android, but I know with iPhone, there's probably a way they could have done it. I know there's a way that they could have kept the phone permanently unlocked, because you can change that. And then maybe they were able to do like a factory reset or something and change it to their face.
Like, that's just a really random thought. It might be 100% irrelevant.
But it might be 100% relevant.
Well, do we know if they were found with their phones?
No, we don't know that.
Because I wonder if they took their phones. That's kind of where my thought is going
right,
here.
If they kept them. Yeah, did they keep them? Yeah. Like, were they there as trophy? I don't know. It hasn't been published yet. If they found the phones in their possession, because I would definitely like to know, again, about the video. Whose phone was it on? Videos, there were 2. How many people had that video? Whose phone was it originally recorded on? I want to know.
But then, like, if they took the phones, you could then get into the conversation of tracking and all of that, which could be very interesting. But that really only matters if they took the phones.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Which they could have done all of this without taking them. That's entirely possible as well.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure, though. But I do know that the suspects are accused of dividing the proceeds between them. This is relevant. The suspects are then accused of taking several things from Ramirez, including a cell phone, before DeMeo, who was charged as an accomplice, allegedly made several unauthorized transactions amounting to $3,200. So did they just take the phone from him and then ditch it later? Or they definitely took it from his body? And John Umberger was also found without his cell phone. So they held them for at least a certain amount of time.
I'm wondering if they took them, found a way to make sure that they were the ones that could get into them, and then did all the transactions after. Because I'm just thinking about, like, okay, you're at the club, you're drugging somebody, and I'm specifically talking more Ramirez in this case. But it's like, okay, you help him to the cab, and then you send him off in a cab. And did you, in that short period of time where you're at the club drugging him, taking his phone and doing all of this in front of him, or like in the bathroom, or like that's kind of where my brain is going with this. Is it's probably easier and smarter for them to take it, at least for a few hours.
Brief period. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they can rewire it so it works with them. And then maybe even turn, like, find my device off or
But you
something.
know what? I don't know how this works. But again, it's like, okay, if you're programming your face into it, if they're specifically saying that it is facial recognition that is accessing these apps, they're programming their own face into it. Isn't that a risk of having now
Yeah.
your face recorded with like
Right.
Apple or like your Android or whatever? Like, is that, I
Right.
don't know. Is that how it works? I'm assuming it is.
Yeah, I think it's a really bad move on their part because I'm sure that the police know if they did do that, they were probably like, this is great. We know exactly who it was. It was these guys.
Right. But unfortunately, they had success with it for a while. So they thought it was a good move.
Yeah, DeMeo, like we just said, was charged allegedly making several unauthorized transactions from Julio and Ramirez's account that amounted to $3,200.
Yeah, well, and you said that they got 200,000. How many other people do we not know are involved in this and they got thousands and thousands of dollars out of?
Yeah. And, how many more people did they do this to that they got thousands and thousands of dollars out of,
Yeah, exactly.
you know? And Hamilton and Butts are also accused of purchasing sneakers with credit card information stored on Ramirez's phone.
Come on, sneakers.
Yeah, exactly. Come on. Hamilton is accused of taking thousands of dollars from Umberger's credit card accounts. Well, he and Butts allegedly made over $3,500 in unauthorized purchases. So $6,700.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Barroso, DeMeo, and Hamilton have all pleaded not guilty. Attorneys for Hamilton and DeMeo did not respond to ABC News' request for comment. However, a lawyer for Barroso was feeling more chatty, saying, for the record, his client, quote, has always maintained his innocence in this case. Which is very interesting, given that he is one of the ones who's caught the most charges.
Yeah, but that's just a line. Like,
Exactly, that's
the
his
lawyer
party
could
line.
easily not believe it, but it's his job to say it.
Yeah, exactly. Former NYPD Chief Detective James Essig told ABC News about some holdups in the arrest for these cases, saying, quote, we arrested people numerous times on the grand larcenies and the robberies, and they just got right back out. It wasn't until we were able to charge them with the homicides, too, and with the robberies that we were able to keep them in jail, end quote.
Interesting.
Yeah, and again, these attacks happened in such quick succession that in between, I know I said this already, but it is wild. In between September 2021 and March of 2022, there were 43 recorded in all in both patterns. In just 5 months, 43 were recorded in aggregate.
Yeah, and I'm
7
really
deaths.
very interested in this, that they were arrested numerous times and just got out. Like, were they out on bail
Right.
and they hadn't gone to trial yet?
Right, and that you had them as a person of interest in this case, but I don't know, like, just didn't pin them down with an additional charge. I'm not sure. Like, how they were able to get out and then, get back arrested. Maybe they bonded out. I don't know.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, is they probably bonded out and this hasn't gone to trial yet because the investigations are still happening. Mm-hmm. So they might not want to go to trial. But then I don't know, were they released because the investigations were still going on and they wanted to try to get them on more? But that's, I don't know. There's so many questions.
Exactly. It's just like research that leads me to more research, like so much research. But at the very least, the family of Julio Ramirez was relieved that the men were put behind bars, saying, quote, to hear the phrase by the NYPD, by the mayor, the murder of Julio Ramirez. was validating. And that was said by Ramirez's close friend, Karenina Quimpo, referring to a press conference held by New York City officials to announce arrests made in connection with the case. Quote, "Finally, we are on the same page and we are on the right path to getting justice for him." End quote.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. We're working to get that justice. And in an interview, Linda Clary, John Umberger's mother, thanked the police department for its work on the case. She said, quote, "I feel relieved and I feel hopeful, but I also feel brokenhearted that these men made the choices they did," she said. "None of this brings John back. We just want people to be safe, and we don't want anyone else to suffer like we have." End quote.
Mm-hmm.
This poor woman. This poor woman.
It's a beautiful way to put it, though, because she's looking at that bigger picture.
Yeah. Yeah. She's not getting her son back. He never is coming home, and it's because of these people. So I hope she gets justice. And in March of 2023, New York City's medical examiner told NBC News that it is investigating several additional deaths in similar circumstances to those of Ramirez and Umberger. They could not confirm whether these deaths are connected to the same suspects. The investigation is ongoing, and the DA's office encourages anyone who believes they fell victim to similar incidents to call the helpline at 212-335-9040. So if you think this may have happened to you or your friends, this is a very, very recent case. And you need to call the helpline. Again, it's 212-335-9040.
Yeah, and honestly, with that, like, obviously, we would personally love it, but share this episode if you have friends who are in New York. Like,
Please,
get the word
do.
out there. Even just our Instagram post, whatever you share, even if it's something super small, like getting this into more people's ears and like into people's minds, so they can reflect and potentially realize that they could have been part of this as a victim.
Yeah.
Share it with as many people as you can.
Yes, please do, because New York City is dangerous enough without animals like this wandering the streets and potentially harming you and your friends. And in that vein, Manhattan DA Bragg said, quote, "Our entire city continues to mourn the tragic losses of Mr. Ramirez and Mr. Umberger. In addition to the pain their deaths have caused their family and loved ones, I know that many other New Yorkers have feared for their own safety when going out to meet up with friends." End quote. And you should never have to feel that way. So, yeah, give this to everybody you know in New York to make sure that they haven't been a victim of these crews, quote unquote. And this is the tale as it currently stands of the drug-facilitated deaths in New York City's nightclub scene. And like I said, I sincerely hope that Julio's family and John's mother, Linda, find justice through the system for their family members. I think this whole thing is so senseless and awful, and it comes down to greed. But also, there may be bigger fish to fry out there, like who is giving these crews their fentanyl. I'll be keeping an eye on it for all of us. Sam, do you have any final thoughts?
Oh, goodness. I have a lot of thoughts, but I think we talked about them a lot through this episode. But I do agree. I think that there's some really crazy connections here. Stuff that is very interesting to dig into. And there, like, we do have to acknowledge there might not be any connection between what you presented us in the Katie Gallagher case and this one. It is entirely possible.
Right.
It's just hard to ignore a lot of the similarities that we are seeing.
Thank you. Yes. Because as I was doing this research, I was like, this seems too kismet for these criminals that they all may have had the same idea. I don't know. but I think it's worth asking the question.
Yeah, and honestly, like, it seems like it's like a Law and Order episode where it's like the one topic that spreads over multiple episodes in the season. Like, this is what it feels like.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I'm going to keep my finger on the pulse of this one, because I want to know. I want some of these, like, coincidences to be explained, and maybe the police and investigators have definitive proof that Katie's string is different from this one. But if they do, I look forward to hearing it.
Yeah, I've been very purposely waiting on watching Stephanie Harlow's episode that she put out on this. I think it's on this. She titled it like "What's Happening in New York" or something like that. And I love her. I watch a ton of her videos and I listen to her other podcasts that she has. And I've been
we'll have to send her.
Oh, I'll send you her links. I've been listening to a lot of her Crime Weekly with Derek Levasseur. I've been listening to them a lot lately. But she put out this episode on New York. And I am like, I've been wanting to watch it because it came out like the day that you said you wanted to do this follow-up. And I really like, now I can go back. I can watch it now.
Right. And do tell if there's something I missed, and she touches on it. But also, yeah, we should reach out to them with this episode once we've finished recording it.
Yeah, if you haven't, I mean, you've probably heard of her. I know the prosecutors have talked about them. So you very well might know exactly who she is, and her name might not be ringing a bell. She's fantastic.
Yeah.
My shout out to any of our listeners who haven't heard of them. Do yourself a favor, check them out. They're really, really cool.
What's the name of the podcast?
So Stephanie Harlow, she does, I think she's just Stephanie Harlow on YouTube. She I think she only does her channel on YouTube. But then she has another podcast with Derek Levasseur, who is a private investigator, formerly a detective turned private investigator. And they have Crime Weekly, which that's what I've been diving into a lot lately. I just finished their Jennifer Kessie episodes today. And that might be a case I want to cover soon because that's a good case and it's very baffling. But they're very interesting. They have a very good conversation.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, I've been kind of binging them.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sticking with us, folks, because I know that was a little bit of a doozy. I hope I did an okay job at explaining it.
I think you did, because there's so many details to this, and I followed along the whole time. And I think that is definitely a good sign that our listeners will as well.
Good, because so many quirks, so many weird things.
Yes. But thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And you can also find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, and on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.
Bye. Thank you.